everyone. Welcome back to another episode of BEaTS Research Radio in our special episodes with mentors who inspire us. A series of episodes that we have dedicated to many Canadian researchers who actually been somehow paved the way for many of us. And speaking in this case by Dr. Cornelia Bohne from University of Victoria. And she's a leader in the field of supramolecular chemistry and photochemistry as well. And she has been a mentor to many young researchers like myself. I have learned many things from Cornelia. And one of the things I have learned the most is about, being accurate when you're reporting data, something that is critical for science reproducibility. But also Cornelia has a special story. And she's also an immigrant and became a Canadian like many of us. And today is, to me, really a privilege of introducing Dr. Cornelia Bohne. And I would like to ask you the first question before you say hello to us is, how do you come to Canada and how do you start with science? Thank you so much, Cornelia, for being with us today.
Thank you, Emilio. Thank you for inviting me here to come and tell a little bit of my story and with relationship to mentorship, which the first thing I want to say, mentorship is there for your whole life in different forms. So mentors are super important, but they're there for life. So let me start on how I came to Canada, and then I will track back on how I got excited in science. So during my PhD, my supervisor in Brazil, Giuseppe Cilento, called me in one day and says, I have this professor coming from Canada, Brian Dunford from the University of Alberta, and he's an enzymologist, and I would like you to work with him. So it was really a by chance situation in which I worked with Brian. Brian invited me to come to Canada after he was in Brazil. I stayed in Alberta for 5 months. And that was a time in which I never believed that I would be traveling as much as I did later in my life. And I said, well, if I am in Canada, I want to visit some labs that I read the papers of and are really interesting. So I went to labs in California and in Iowa, but the one that's relevant for my story is I went to Ottawa and met Tito Scaiano. And it was a very frightening first seminar ever in English with Tito and Keith Ingold and Dave Griller in the room, but we finished and they were all discussing my science and I got super excited and Tito invited me to come to Canada. So that's how I came to Canada is I decided to take the chance of trying my own path. My lab in Brazil had a very defined path that if you did your PhD, you worked to Germany and you work in Valdemar Adams group and then you would come back to Brazil, become a faculty member and so on. So it is this desire to try something different and I was fascinated with Canada. But my story on how I got into science starts very early, and it starts with mentorship that is really important and you don't normally realize it. And it starts by having parents which were super supportive of me just doing what I like to do. So my mother was a seamstress and I didn't like to wear dresses, so that was a disappointment for her. But it let me take anything apart that wasn't working anymore. At the time I could take things apart but not put them together yet. And then I had a grandfather who was a chemist and an agronomist, and I still vividly remember I must have been between 10 and 12 years. I got a new blackboard and I asked Grandpa, draw something for me. I don't know what's on the left side. I can't see that in my memory, but on the right side is CO2 and water. And he explained me what that was. And I said, oh, I want to be as clever as him when I grow up. So it was really important that as a girl, I was given the space to explore what I liked, right? So I think maybe that's not mentorship, but it's important because it informed me on how to become a mentor later on. And that is, every person is an individual. So every person in my research group is an individual. Each individual has different career aspirations. Each individual has different strengths and weaknesses. And I think mentorship is about providing people with options. So in giving them options, what they can do in life. I will fast forward through my career through in university. In university, certainly my supervisor was a mentor. Giuseppe Cilento studied a field that Probably when he started in the late 60s, early 70s, people thought that, why is he doing that? He looked at the excited triplet states in biological systems. He chose the wrong reactive intermediate, but the right idea. And he provided me with this vision that if you think you want to study something and it's very well thought through, you should do it, even if others think it's not what should be done. He never told me this directly, but his encouragement were around that area. And there's another person who was very important to me in Brazil, and that was Frank Keenan, who is a photochemist. He's still at the University of São Paulo in the Institute of Chemistry. And he was a person who I would go to whenever I had a question. And I would get my question answered, not by him, but by him guiding me. But I would leave his office always with more questions that I came in with. Okay. And that's something else I learned from him, is that there is a value when you are developing or helping a coworker develop into a scientist, is to guide them on the questions they have, but to challenge them what the next steps are. So that was very important to me. And then when I came to Canada and did my postdoc with Tito Scaiano, he was a mentor in many ways. He was a mentor on how to review papers. He was a mentor on how to set up labs. It was a wonderful situation because my desk was besides his office at NRC, where he was at the time, and over lunch he would just throw challenges at me. And early on he says, you will have as many projects as you can handle, and being slightly stubborn, I said, well, I will handle them all. So he wanted to give me a project 2 weeks before I was leaving, and I said, no, that's it. Right. But he has also been supportive to my career. We have had lots of discussions on how to lead a research group and how to move things forward. So mentorship to me is a conversation in which, as a mentor, you try to figure out what the mentee wants to accomplish, and you provide them with options on how to do that. It is not telling people how to do things. Right?
So when you think about mentorship for the next generations, and you're also having in there imply that EDI, diversity is critical around that. So what are your thoughts about how important is diversity in science, and from your experience leading your research teams and all the teams you have been part of what do you think about diversity in science?
So you will have noted that all the mentors I mentioned, besides my parents, right, were the two of them, were males, right? But I had role models, okay? Both my grandmothers worked in the 1920s in Germany before they married. And two of my aunts had a professional life. And one of my, she would be an aunt to my father, was a journalist and then worked in the banking system in Germany. And so I think, and then I went to a university in Brazil where many of the faculty members in Brazil, probably for historical reasons, were women. So when I came, so there were lots of things which were problematic being a woman in Brazil, which were more societally based on what your position was and what was expected of you and so on. Within the scientific environment, there was more of an egalitarian view than I encountered when I came to U of I. Because in Tito's group in Ottawa, so in Brian Dunford's group in Alberta, it was gender balance, and in Tito's group in Ottawa was gender balance. So I learned more about the barriers that are not so obvious. So if you live in a society like Brazil, the barriers, well, at least to me, they are more obvious, maybe because I grew up there.
Yeah.
But here I learned over time the barriers that are not so obvious. And I think those barriers exist. It's not only for women, it's for all kinds of minorities, is what I normally call anyone who doesn't fit into the cloning mode. So reproducing the career path that others have seen as successful, it's difficult for those people to find a voice. Okay. Well, there's one way to progress is you just ignore it and do your own thing. I was told when I started at UVic in 1992 that I shouldn't collaborate. 2 years later, I decided that that was not the way my science would really progress. I was coming from Brazil, where collaborating was a necessity out of not having enough chemicals and so on. And I started collaborating, and it served me really well. And the whole community was changing its idea about collaboration. So mentorship in EDI is, again, making sure that people see the barriers, and then you provide the person being mentored with the options on what to do and where to go. In particular, when there are situations in their events in which people were discriminated, which can be very, very complicated to move them forward and very complicated to resolve, but you cannot ignore them. I think you have to take them forward and you have to move them forward. In my research group, we have talked about EDI. I don't think we have talked sufficiently. We are currently working on creating an EDI statement for the group and so on. And the Angewandte paper you just mentioned before we started, we spent a group meeting dissecting it and seeing how different people in a diverse group react differently to the statements they made. It was made in that article. So it's a conversation, and it's a normalization of the conversation. It's not a zero-sum game, right? You bring in a diverse person. It doesn't mean that a non-diverse person, if that even exists, but another person is not valued. It is looking at what the strengths are that different people can bring to the solution of a problem, and to acknowledge, and that's really important, that we all have biases and blind spots and don't see some of the things that we do with respect to EDI. So I see it as extremely valuable, the exercise NSERC has initiated a few years ago, to make us all in the community think about EDI and articulate what we're doing and what we will do into the future.
In that sense, Cornelia, is certainly we are humans, right? And humans, they like it or not, they will be biased. But it's something that I would like to actually, it really resonate on me, is that the first step for really implementing an EDI is assuming that we are going to be biased and recognizing that we are not perfect, even though we're immigrants, because that's the way it goes. Having people from diverse, ethnicities within in a lab, it doesn't mean that it's a fully integrated EDA lab. You have to really have a structure, a policy, and being able to pass it along and really train individuals with the EDI switch in mind is also critical, right?
Yeah. So I think implicit bias is always there. We all have it, and we're humans, and there's no way around it. I think it's important that you recognize it and try to normalize that other people really pointed out to you, and you say, whoops, yeah, sorry about that, let's do this differently. So that's the first step, to acknowledge we all have an implicit bias. The diversity in the group comes in many different ways. I mean, gender diversity is one of them, but I think, and this will probably resonate with you, Emilio, knowing how you work in a very interdisciplinary team. Having people who have different languages around science and different ways of thinking about it, it leads necessarily to better solutions, because I myself have to articulate what I'm thinking in a much clearer manner, so that the diverse team that I have will understand.
Mm-hmm.
So over the years, I have had chemists in my group, I had biochemists in my group, I had engineers in my group, and I have had group members who became lawyers, doctors, and chemists, and photographers. And I think it inherently needs to a better solution by having diverse ways of thinking about a problem. And that requires that you, when you're solving the problem, you try to have an environment in which there's no judging. Okay? The no judging of, oh, this is a very simple question. Why are you even asking that? That's not a way to go, normally a good way to go, because if someone didn't understand that simple question, it's because we didn't articulate the concept.
Yeah. Those are excellent points, particularly when you are when you're working on a scientific article, you have to be able to articulate the idea really well and easy to understand and easy to flow. It doesn't mean that the science is not going to be there. The idea has to be sounded and it has to be easy to understand upfront, Mm-hmm. And this is something that I particularly learned from you. Cornelia, what is your philosophy for mentoring, if you can share it with us? And what will be one tip you would like to give to those looking for a mentor?
Okay, to begin with, I didn't tell you all the mentors, like great mentors I had at UVic, okay? So I had very different mentors. I had mentors like Peter Wan on photochemistry, Tom Files on almost everything, Alex Macaulay earlier on how to navigate the university system. So I will tell you first what I do when I'm looking for a mentor, because I'm still being mentored, right?
Oh,
yeah. I've tried to find, so I talk to a series of people, and it's the person who listens to me and understands normally much better what my problem is than I understand myself, because I haven't been able to articulate yet what is the problem that I'm asking for mentorship with. So I think the first thing is talk to lots of people and see the ones that resonate with you on your style, and then they become mentors. So assignment of mentors is valuable. I think it's valuable to have mentors assigned within the department for the younger faculty, and they may become a more broader mentor over time, or they may not, and you may find somebody else. Okay, so the tip I give is, as a mentor, is you need to listen, and listen carefully and understand where the person is coming from, and not say, well, that's not the way we do things, right? So it's a lot of sitting down and listening and understanding where they're coming from. In general, when someone is looking for you for mentorship, it's because there's a problem, and they haven't yet articulated exactly what the problem is. So listening to me is the key point of being a good mentor.
And what is your philosophy for mentoring? So if you could share some with us. How do you actually do the mentoring? Is you listen to the mentee, you let them to find their own solution or their own path, or you share your personal experiences with them?
I try to share personal experiences without making them examples for them to follow, okay? I think it's important for you to leave the options open for each person to find their own way in how they are moving forward. And I moved into that much later in life. I'm still a person. If I have a problem, I want it solved now and get rid of it. But I've learned that in that I was projecting, in some cases, my own way of seeing the problem and of solving the problem, which not necessarily took into account the person. So I do share my own experience. I do set time aside, which is important, and not be rushing through those meetings. Depending on what mentorship role I'm in, I may set up meetings on a weekly basis Like if it's a more formal role within the department, I like to do that. And then I like to go to a bi-weekly basis and so on. But there's not a formula that fits all. So the best question here is actually for Emilio, because you will have seen the style more than I can maybe articulate.
Can you repeat the question, Cornelia?
Well, you could answer the question of what my mentoring style is, right?
I think your mentoring style is showing us how things are done, pointing out where, you know, the needs for us to realize what needs to be done. And you know, that is critical. You know, that you are showing us what the critical parts needs to be addressed, pointing us and letting us to find the way how to do that. You know, not telling us this is the way how things are done. It's just you find your own style, but these are the things you need to address. And that is really critical, you know, because it's like the art of writing, you know, like every time I'm teaching about, you know, how to write scientific articles, I personally reconciled with those discussions we used to have, that you have to find your own style, but you have to make sure that the article reads nicely and it flows. The science is in there and it has to be evident, but you have to do it in your own style. That is the way I see your mentorship.
Okay, which is aligned to what I said, but I think it brings me to a point which is very important to mention, especially right now with all the difficulties around the COVID situation, but also social upheaval and so on, is that no matter what style you have, no matter what writing style or supervision style or the own style you have, it's important to be clear about the values, right? So just let's take the example on publications, where I think it's important to be clear that when you're putting a paper out there, you took care of the details, you took care that the numbers mean something, which numbers are really important for the science we do, and other science is not as important. And so to revolve your decisions around values, and that's really important in a time when there is a lot of anxiety and a lot of stresses. So how do we lead a lab under physical distancing rules where you cannot put everyone into the lab? How do you make access equitable, right, and inclusive? How are you going to have the conversation around that, and what are the values? So if I can rephrase now that I'm thinking a bit more about my mentoring style, is I like to tell people what my values are on a subject and then provide them with options to move forward. I think that is probably a better description.
Oh yeah, it's a perfect one. It's a perfect one, because you know, with all the crisis, because it's a crisis on the reproducibility, right? And you know, being accurate on how to report the data, how you make the paper reproducible for someone else, is also that it's implicit in your style, you know, like and that is incredibly valuable, and we have learned a lot about that. But this is just one of the many things, and that is super important, you know, like when you're thinking about the crisis of reproducibility. I always tell my students, just take this and see the example. This is the way you report the data. You report the data or your science in a way that people will be able to reproduce it. Because it's not just about the data, it's about the protocol, how you did it, how many times you repeat it, how you run the stats and stuff like that. And that is super critical. And Cornelia, you know, I would like you to, if you can give a message of to our audience, to the young researchers listening to this, what would it be in the times of COVID, about, you know, trying to not be resilient, but trying to understand that we're humans and we have limitations? What would it be from you to them?
I've been doing a lot of, this will be a bit longer maybe than you thought, but been doing a lot of thinking on how to move my own research group forward. And the experience of living in Brazil during the late 70s and early 80s when I went to university under a military dictatorship, so the rule of law is not exactly upheld, and under conditions in which we had to import chemicals twice a year. So if we made a mistake on our order in January, July we would fix the mistake, led me to realize that we need to think differently on how we are doing science. And that doesn't mean we're going to do it better or worse. We will be doing it differently. And if we get it right, we will doing it as well or better than we did it before. Right. So moving the group out of the lab was difficult for everyone, was difficult for me, was difficult for the group. Moving it back in, we are now moving it in under very different ways of operating. We are all 2 meters apart, and only photochemists will understand this, but it's like triplet states. The spins are correlated at 2 meters. I had to throw this one in. It's a different way of interaction, and I think you need to have patience with yourself. And I think you need to have the vision that it will be okay. I mean, most of us will come out of this. Most of us will be doing research. The research will be of high caliber, but we need to do it differently. And we need to think on how to do it differently. And so one of the things we are doing right now in the group is each person is thinking about what their key experiments are so that we can then do the scheduling and moving people back in. But I do realize the anxiety is really high because people think, well, what happens if we have to close again and so on. And then you have to ask yourself, what is the primary objective? And you have to go back. What is the primary objective of whatever you are doing, right? So if we didn't have enough food around, which is not a problem, the primary objective would be to find food, right? So what's the primary objective of having a research group right now? And in my view, the balance is to provide the education to the students, even if that might lead to a diminishing publication rate. Because I think that value to me is more important, because each one of the students who are in the group and who will be joining will be citizens tomorrow, and hopefully they will contribute to the community. And so it's finding this balance and not losing the perspective that yes, there is a day after COVID in which things will be a lot less restricted. We will have a lot more certainty. And I think that kind of thinking comes from having grown up and not having known any differently as I grew up, living under a non-democratic system and then coming to Canada. And it was fantastic, right? And it was democratic. I remember Brian Dunford telling me that if you run into trouble, Cornelia, just look for a policeman. And apparently I was shocked about that. And you might be able to find some resonance with that. But also, I was in the lab here, and the Eppendorf tips were disposable. In Brazil, we washed them, right? And we still did science, right? We still educated people, and we still did high caliber science. So not let the surrounding, which is changing, like the policies around physical distancing, affect the core of what needs to be done, which is education of the students, the publication of the papers, and so on.
That's a really powerful message, and brings me back to always to the sense of collegiality we had seen during the last months. You know, and normally academia is really competitive, but I had the feeling that we have changed. We have actually probably, you know, went back to what it used to be, more collegiality. If you need any help, my lab is open to you, and we will actually pull it together. And this is truly a powerful message, and Cornelia. And thank you so much again for taking the time of being with us today. And it was a pleasure as always. good to catch up with you and, discuss more about, like life and more than science, right? Because this is the way it goes. Thank you again. And thank you to all of our listeners, and stay tuned, because we're going to keep having these great episodes of Mentors Who Inspire Us. And thank you again for listening to us, and also all those who made possible BEaTS Research Radio, University of Ottawa Heart Institute, the Department of Biochemistry, Microbiology, and Immunology at University of Ottawa, and the Canadian Biomaterials Student Chapter of the Canadian Biomaterials Society for being supporters of this show. Cornelia, thank you so much again. It's always a pleasure talking to you, and stay safe and healthy. Hopefully in the near future, we're going to have you back in Ottawa to have a cup of coffee and discuss more about what science is all about.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me and for giving me this opportunity. It's a great series that you guys are putting together.
Thank you so much, Cornelia. I appreciate it.